Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is K. Scott Griffith. I'll tell you all about Scott in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we show toward others. And when you do it from a leadership position, as you will definitely discover that Scott Griffith is, you do it to bring people together for common cause. Welcome to Grace Under Pressure, K. Scott Griffith.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, I want to tell folks all about you. K. Scott Griffith is the founder and managing partner of SJ Collaborative Solutions, an enterprise risk management firm, and you specialize in reliable performance and high consequence industries and organizations. Your clients span the globe: Harvard's Mass General, Brigham system, California hospitals, global medical things. You're also a veteran of the airline industry, and you are the author of a brand new book called Managing Risk, which is why we're going to be speaking to you today. So welcome, K. Scott Griffith.
Thank you, John. Let's get started.
You got it. Spoken like a true airline pilot. I don't think I mentioned that you were a former airline pilot. Anyway, you first became involved, or at least in this book, interested in safety, obviously as a pilot, but you witnessed a crash. Do you want to talk about what you saw and how that influenced your development into managing risk?
Sure, be happy to, John. So in 1985, I was a young, newly hired pilot at American Airlines, and I was doing a walk-around inspection on a Boeing 727, preparing to fly from Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport up to New York's LaGuardia. And I looked up in the sky and I saw a Delta wide-body jet, a Lockheed TriStar L-1011. And this was a typical summer day, August 2nd, 1985. A few summer clouds developing, a little bit of rain showers, nothing you would expect out of the ordinary. But when I looked up and saw this plane, it was in distress. And it turns out that the plane actually got so low on the approach that it struck a car on Highway 114 just north of the airport and then bounced up. And I'm watching the plane, hoping against hope that it could make the runway, but the left wing struck an above ground water tower, and the airplane cartwheeled and crashed into a ball of fire. And then a few seconds, or perhaps almost a minute later, I was engulfed in a torrent of rain and wind, violent wind. So this had a dramatic effect on me. And it turns out that that plane crashed due to a weather phenomenon known as a microburst. Now, a microburst, for those of you that aren't familiar with the meteorology, is an intense downburst of wind that comes out of storm developments that then, when it hits the ground, that column of wind fans up into what we call vortices, or these curling patterns. Interestingly enough, those wind fields are invisible to the human eye, and they're also invisible to radar. So at the time that this happened, the industry was just beginning to learn about the dangers of a microburst. So subsequent to that, John, I took a leave from the airline and went to work as a physicist for a small company under a grant from NASA. And we developed a laser system. Today, it's called LiDAR. You may be familiar with the term LiDAR. A lot of autonomous vehicles are using them. We have them on our cell phones, by the way, on some of the more advanced cell phones. But it was a way to develop a technology that could see ahead of the aircraft and predict where these dangerous wind fields were located. So that became a driving metaphor in my professional life. I came back to the airline, and I came away with the lesson that the reason that plane crashed was because the pilots couldn't see or understand the risk in front of them. And that became the driving metaphor for the remainder of my professional life. So today, hopefully, we'll have a chance to talk about how that applies to business.
Oh, that's great. And that's, I love how your background in science and avionics, or aviation and science, is what lessons you're learning from there, you're applying to business and then managing risk. And so let's talk about things, because you say there can be a pattern for mishaps. What kind of pattern, and what should we be looking for? What should managers be aware of?
So the pattern that exists, John, and I say in the book that there's a pattern to how bad things happen, and there's a science to prevent them. And it's a science. It's going to be kind of a geeky term, but it's called socio-technical science. And the term socio comes from the Latin meaning people. And the technical side involves the systems in which we operate, whether the systems are hardware, software, artificial intelligence, whatever the system elements, the technological elements are, they are interfacing usually with people. So when we get in our automobile, it's a socio-technical device. It has brakes, it has features, it has safety features on it, but how we drive it makes a big difference. So that intersection between the technology and the people is where we focus our attention in high reliability. So the pattern that typically exists is that systems are often designed to work, and they typically do, but any engineer will tell you that no system is 100% reliable. Now, oh, by the way, I'll say this: engineers don't think like real humans, do they? Engineers expect what they design to work, but we all know that technology doesn't always work as planned. So there's a term in the engineering science called resiliency. So there's two aspects or two attributes to any system. How effective is it when things go right, but how resilient is it to recover when things go wrong? So you can actually engineer resilience into systems. If you leave the house and you forget to turn the coffee maker off, you could create a potential fire hazard. Many devices, in fact, most devices today have an automatic timer that turns off, or think about an iron on an ironing board. So that's a resilience feature. On our devices, hair dryers and electrical equipment, if we plug those into a circuit that is not ground fault interrupt circuit, then a short in that circuit or contact with water could create a hazard and could electrocute you. So we have put ground fault circuit interrupter outlets on places where we expect water to be. Interestingly enough, humans don't always operate devices as they were designed.
So I can't believe that, Scott. That shocks me. This is news.
So are you making a pun that it shocked you? So on that same vein, so if you notice, if you check your hair dryer at home, most likely it has a ground fault circuit breaker in the device. Why? Because they figured out that people would take the hair dryer on the back porch to dry off the dog after you gave them a bath. Well, so that's called redundancy. So systems aren't always designed for resilience in certain areas where you would expect them to, like hospitals, for example. Now, the aviation environment. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as you were the theme of the engineering, but I'll make a little bit of a lighthearted comment, but I think drills down to what you are all about is that, as you describe it, engineers' job is to protect us from ourselves. And so I think in some ways, and that's what your book is doing, and applying the lessons you've learned from aviation and systems you've designed and worked with, applying it to the human element in the workplace, whatever that workplace may be. Am I correct with that, Scott? So
you are correct. So as we move our discussion from how systems are designed to how people operate them, right? That's the quirky component known as the human being is often hard to predict. And what I tried to articulate in the book was that we expect people to follow rules. We write procedures and policies, but we're not rule followers by design. But naturally, we are inclined to break rules. If you don't believe me, just go out on the freeway, get in the left lane, and drive the speed limit, no more, no less.
Oh, yeah.
And watch the reaction of the other drivers. In fact, several studies have shown, John, that on any given day, about 81% of us are driving over the speed limit. Now, we're not doing it to cause an accident or get a ticket. We're doing it because we think we're safe. We think we're okay. The one important message for our listeners to take home is that many times we take risky behaviors or we make risky choices, and the result is positive. We get away with it. So our brain says, I can do this. Nothing bad has happened to me. And we start to believe that it will always give us the same result. When in fact, when the conditions change, circumstances or the environment changes, that same risk-taking behavior can cause catastrophe. So we often learn the wrong lesson from our successful outcomes, whether it's running a business, making a decision around supply chains and only relying on one supplier, or expecting your people to work harder and faster and more overtime. It might have worked in the past, but there's a limit to how those risky choices will affect us in the things that we do. And then you mentioned that systems are designed to protect humans, but then when things do go wrong, the lawyers step in. And
well, that's a whole nother show.
It's a whole nother level. Now, I used to make jokes about lawyers until my daughter, who's a third-year law student here in Dallas, sent me a cease and desist letter and said, Dad, it's not funny anymore. So,
well, in deference to your daughter, we will move on. Now, I do, because you did talk about this. It's talking about the human element and taking risks, and we as human beings do that. Well, you know as well as I do, that the concept of risk is not something that many executives fear. And as a matter of fact, it's you take a risk to explore a new opportunity. So where do you draw the line, Scott? So what's your advice on that?
You're exactly right, John. Most CEOs and certainly entrepreneurs are risk takers. That's how they achieve the success and the opportunities that present themselves. So we don't want people to be risk averse. Getting out of bed in the morning carries risk. Getting in a car, taking a shower. We want you to be risk intelligent. And so risk intelligence means seeing and understanding the risks in front of you and knowing how to manage it. And bad things don't just happen by random chance. They happen because of probabilistic determinants, which means we make choices and we operate systems. And yes, there's some element of chance in the world around us, but we improve our chances when we understand these basic concepts: how to make systems more resilient when things go wrong, how to teach people to make choices where the consequence of that choice is recoverable. So those are the kind of things that CEOs can learn. And from that, they will gather more opportunities. And in some cases, you will increase your risk when the opportunities are worth the effort. So we don't want people to always minimize risk. Sometimes you take on risk for the greater good. We see this in healthcare. We see it in all areas of the world around us.
Right. Now, as we're exploring risk, as you do in your book, Managing Risk, Scott, you do explore, there are biases that we have toward taking a risk. Is it simply like, well, that's not going to happen to me? Or explain that, Scott. So.
There's a whole host of plethora, if you will, of human biases. A few of the most common and severe biases we see are something we call outcome bias. So an outcome bias is we look at the result, and business leaders are prone to do this. We measure results. Well, you can get good results, even great results, with very risky systems and very risky behaviors until something goes wrong and you have catastrophe. You can look back in history at the Titanic or the space shuttle accidents or a host of train accidents where people engaged in behaviors that generally got them good outcomes until catastrophe struck. So don't be biased by the outcome. And then the other side of the outcome bias is where one side is when we turn a blind eye to risky behaviors because we got a good outcome. But the other side is when we overreact because someone made a human error and we punish them. And the danger in punishing people when bad things happen is that it chills the atmosphere of reporting. So professionals are not likely to come forward if they fear punishment or some type of embarrassment. So outcome bias is very strong. There's a whole host of biases, as I mentioned, like confirmation bias, which means I see something and I expect a certain result. Attribution bias, which is where when I drive over the speed limit, John, I'm justified doing it. When you do it, you're a bad person. So that attribution bias is in all of us. And these are important biases for especially leaders to understand, because we all carry bias. There's implicit bias that we make in our world around us, and there's explicit bias. The only way to manage those biases effectively is to see it and understand it first.
Right. That's a great way of doing it. And throughout your book, you have different chapters. And by the way, I highly recommend the book, Managing Risk. It's easy to read for even somebody like me with a non-science background, but you have lots of diagrams and questions. And I like it. I'm going to say not my favorite part of the book, but at the end, you have key takeaways. So if you miss this stuff, just go, there's a couple pages, you sum up the entire book. So that's great. Good for you. You have a chapter on organizational reliability, and I think that's important to anyone running an organization, a series of systems. So explain what you mean by organizational reliability. Is that the same as resilience, or how do you frame it, Scott?
There's 4 steps in what I call the sequence of reliability. It's step 1 is to see and understand risk. Step 2 is to make your systems more reliable. Step 3 is to manage people, starting with what we call human performance and human behavior. And the last step is organizational reliability. And the reason organizational reliability comes last, and there are business books abound that talk about culture, that talk about leadership. And my central thesis is you can't manage culture and be a good leader until you understand risk, systems, and people, because organizations are comprised of systems and people. If you can understand the science about how to make systems and people more reliable, then you can put in the organizational structure for sustainment. I think what you'll recognize, John, is that the most charismatic leaders enjoy success when they're able to lead people well. But guess what? Every one of us, you and I, are temporary. We're either going to expire or retire or get promoted. Someone else is going to come into our jobs, and they're going to want to do things differently than we did, if for no other reason than because they want their own mark on the business. Sustainable organizations, those that weather economic downturns and upturns, changing environments like we saw with the pandemic, changing market demographics and customer demand, the ones that are most able to adapt are the leaders that understand how systems and people work. So organizational reliability is really about seeing and understanding risk, putting the people into the best system you can design, and then managing those people well through the science I mentioned in the book.
Well, that's right. And the organization, I love the concept of organizational reliability, because you're blending the science, the engineering, with the people aspect, which is maybe a dangerous combination or perhaps an altruistic combination. But I like how you say the sustainability, because it is true. Those businesses which weather they've been around for 50, 60, 100 years or so, have good systems in place. Yet, at the same time, organizations such as them have taken big risks, otherwise change their business model to adapt to a changing time. So when do you know you need to change, Scott?
That's a great question. So there are 2 ways that risk affects us in the organization. There's the external risk, like we saw during the pandemic, changing markets, changing environments, supply chains, and the like. And then there's the internal risks of employee burnout or employee dissatisfaction, turnover. And oftentimes when you're in a business that's forward-facing, and by forward-facing, I mean interacting directly with the public. So a service industry or Apple, you mentioned Apple, they provide products to consumers. A lot of times the people on the front line are the first ones to recognize risks that come about. So you won't find it sitting in the C-suite or the boardroom. You may have good instincts and you may be able to look at the external, but you won't know what the risks are internally without getting that from your employees. Now,
Well,
if you're
let's stop there because I think this is a key point, especially for senior leaders, and how do we find out what's going on at the front lines, Scott? So,
so easier said than done. So this is another turning point in my life. And when I came back from the building the first system to detect microburst wind shear, I started a program in the airline industry called Aviation Safety Action Program. And it was a self-reporting program for pilots and mechanics and dispatchers and ground workers and flight attendants to report risk where in years past they would not have reported. And we had a collaborative team, the regulator, the labor union, and the airline working collaboratively to respond to the risk. And from that, this metaphor of the iceberg came about. And in the time that we started the program to today, the airline industry has achieved a 95% reduction in the fatal accident rate. We switched our mindset from waiting for the plane to crash and going investigating it to diving, which the metaphor is that's the tip of the iceberg, to diving below the surface where the employees would tell us where the risks really were. So once we started diving below the surface, we were able to collect information that we hadn't had before. In any business, here's an example, and this is a very current example. I just read, you may be aware of controversy around a company called WebMD. WebMD is one of those go-to sources for medical advice. Well, like most businesses, they were dramatically hit by the pandemic. And so they reached a point now where they're requiring all the workers to return to the office. So their CEO and their C-suite hired a marketing firm and they put out this video and they tried to make it somewhat humorous, but they were ordering people to come back to the office. And what they didn't recognize was that many of their employees took that as an assault on their ability to perform their jobs. And so there was a backlash. Now, I don't know what the ultimate right answer is for every business, but I do know we can't order our employees to be happy. We can't order our
I like how you put that. That's almost akin. I hadn't heard that phrase before. It's almost like ordering people to be innovative.
You can't order them to be happy. You can't order them to be productive without giving them the tools and the systems to do that. I work with some of the best in the world. We work with hospitals and airlines and manufacturing companies, and even in those that have the best reputation in the world, employee burnout is a thing. It is something that every business is, particularly those that interact with the public, is susceptible to. We won't get there just on our reputation. We will have to innovate. And part of that innovation is listening to the people who are doing the work. When you and I were growing up, John, it was used to be the customer is king. Well, that attitude is going to burn our employees out. We have to put the employees in the center of that consideration.
So this is a good question because burnout is in a sense. I know you work in healthcare, and I know firsthand the effects of burnout from colleagues of mine who are in the medical field, and they're the most dedicated people but they're also human. So what can businesses do, be it healthcare or otherwise, not to protect their employees, maybe protect them from themselves? But very often healthcare workers put others first. That's their nature. So what advice do you have, Scott?
Well, I will tell you first, I'll tell you what not to do, and then I will tell you what organizations can do. And there is a science to do this. The first thing not to do is not put the whole responsibility on the employee to be more resilient. In other words, we're not going to build a better canary in the mine shaft, if you know what the expression is. If people are burning out, we have to look at all the contributors, including the organizational contributors, the competing priorities that we put onto our employees, and the stresses that they feel. Yes, they can go do yoga and they can pet a dog. I had one person I interviewed said, "I'm so glad, Scott, you're not going to tell me to pet a dog. I've done that.
That's a good one.
And I love dogs, but that won't, taking yoga classes, which I fully support, maintaining mental health and self-care is vitally important to all of us. But if I go to work and the stress is in my work environment, if I'm overly stressed, that's an organizational responsibility. It's not my responsibility to go back and get enough rest and mental health. It's a shared commitment between the organization and the employees. The first thing you can do as a business is to create a trusted system that invites people to report risk and feelings of burnout without fear of reprisal or recrimination. I'll tell you an example. There was one very famous health system that was conducting a survey on level of burnout, and they wanted to know how stressed their employees were feeling. And it was a 5-point Likert scale where you list, on a scale of 1 to 5, how burned out you felt. And if you selected 3 or higher, a message would pop up suggesting you seek psychological counseling. What do you think the employees did when they got that pop-up message? They lowered their score because no one wanted to be marked as a complainer or someone that needed psychological help, which we all do sometimes in our life. So don't put the responsibility on the employee. Now, it's not enough just to have a great manager that says, one manager told me, oh, my employees will tell me when they're burned out. I have a holiday party every year, and they come up and they tell me. That's not an effective way to get input from your employees. Create a trusted system, have some rules and conditions and confidentiality, and then do something tangible with the information you get. That's how you help create a better environment for your employees.
Good. I like that, how you were saying it. Essentially, it's making it safe for people to, but also protecting them, not in a paternalistic way, but in a way that enables them to seek help when necessary, but also not put undue pressure on them so that they overwork themselves, which so often happens, particularly in healthcare. That is a serious issue right now. Scott, I could keep going for hours with you, but I know time is precious. And as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Is there one that you would wish to share with us?
Well, this was a very powerful moment. I'm going to show some vulnerability. When I was about 17 years old, I had learned how to fly, and I may have been even younger than that, but I was very young. And I took off from an airport one day, and part of the experience you have to get is you have to fly to other airports and land at different places. So I took off from one airport. I flew about 10 or 12 miles to this other airport, not recognizing that a front had come through and the wind had shifted. And as I was coming down on this small airport, a little single runway with no control tower, I didn't recognize that I had a tailwind and not a headwind. Now, for those of you that aren't pilots, you typically want to land into the wind, not with the wind behind you. So I touched down on the runway, and I was going too fast because I had a wind at my back, and I was about to go off the end of the runway and crashed through a fence, and I slammed the brakes on. The plane skidded, and as it did, the wing touched a wind tetrahedron, which is a large device that's supposed to indicate where the wind is. It nicked the wind tetrahedron. The plane spun around, and I came to a stop. This old man came running out, who owned the airport, and yelled at me, "What are you doing? Don't you know you can't land with a tailwind?" And he looked at me and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, let me help you paint that tip of your wing, and nobody has to know about this." And I thought, oh my gosh, he just saved my entire career. I went back and I told the owner of the flight school what happened. And he said, "Since you came forward, there will be no repercussions." Had I not done that, I would have carried that secret with me the rest of my life. So flash forward about 20 some odd years, when I went to the airline industry, I created a program for pilots to come forward and disclose not only the risk outside their cockpit, but the risk coming from themselves. And that was transformative for the airline industry.
What a great story. That is a powerful story. There's about 8 levels of grace in there. The older gentleman who owned the airport, and then you coming forward reporting, and then you taking that lesson to the next step. So, wow, that's a very powerful story, Scott Griffith. So thank you for sharing it. First of all, how can people find you and the book?
Well, you can Google me, K. Scott Griffith, and you'll get to any of the websites. But we have a website for my company called SGC Partners. That's Sierra Golf Charlie for aviation enthusiasts. Sierra Golf Charlie Partners.com, SGCPartners.com, or you can just Google my name and you'll get to the book sites. The book is for sale at all the major retailers, including Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Target, all the booksellers. So.
Well, that's great. And Scott, we will put in the notes the website, so people will have it at the ready. K. Scott Griffith, it has been such a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your story of grace. So with that, we will go out.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Great. We're done.
So, all done? Okay.
I appreciate it. You are a good storyteller, and thank you for blending science and human performance together. That ain't easy. So good for you. So I enjoyed the conversation, and best of luck to you in your business and future and all those kinds of things. So
thank you, John. I enjoyed it very much. I wish you all the best too.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. We'll see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.